In the vast, silent lands of the West, a life is not measured by what is taken, but by the quiet strength found in what remains when all else turns to dust. The sun was a merciless hammer over Dust Devil's Fork, a stagecoach stop that felt more like an ending than a station. This was a place where the hopeful came to wither. Ilara Hayes sat on a splintered bench, her hands clutching a worn suitcase. At 38, pregnant and abandoned, she was a specter at the feast of this harsh land. She had followed Dexter Flynn here, a man whose promises of gold had turned to dust the moment her condition became undeniable. His parting words echoed in the oppressive heat, a cruel whisper about her age, a woman preparing for grandchildren, not a cradle. He had left her with a few dollars, and the vast, empty desert. The few souls in this outpost, prospectors with hollow eyes and weary women in faded calico, watched her. Their gazes were a mixture of pity and suspicion, the kind reserved for a lone woman who spelled trouble. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her along with the sun. East was nothing but ashes for her, a life burned to the ground. There was no returning. She straightened her back, a small act of defiance against the world and the deep ache in her bones. She would not let them see her break. She had spent all her tears in the dark corners of her past life. Now, there was only a hard, brittle resolve. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, the shadows of the giant saguaro cacti stretched like long, skeletal fingers across the sand. The desert grew quiet, a silence that was not peaceful but watchful. A coyote called in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to mock her own solitude. She placed a protective hand on the curve of her belly, a silent promise to the life within. This was her anchor now, the only thing that was truly hers. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She would not falter. A figure emerged from the deep shadows of the livery stable. He was a tall man, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who understood the rhythms of the desert. His duster was the color of the earth, his hat pulled low, obscuring his face. He did not move like the restless men in the saloon, but with a quiet confidence, as if he were a part of the landscape itself. His silence was different from the town's. It was not empty, but full of a weathered patience. He stopped a few paces away, his presence a sudden, solid thing in the fading light. The man's name was Abel Corbin. He finally looked at Ilara, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. There was no pity in his gaze, no indecent curiosity, only a calm assessment of her situation. "A dust storm is coming," he said, his voice low and steady, like rocks shifting deep in the earth. "The nights out here are colder than a banker's heart." He did not ask why she was alone or where she was headed. He simply stated facts. "My ranch has a solid roof, and there is hot stew on the fire." The offer was plain, without the sting of charity she had come to expect from men. Ilara remained silent, her knuckles white on the handle of her suitcase. She had learned long ago that kindness from strange men often came with a hidden price. Trust was a currency she could no longer afford to spend. She studied his face, weathered by sun and wind, the lines around his eyes telling of years spent under an open sky. There was no cunning in them, only a deep, unsettling stillness. She could not read him, and that frightened her more than any open threat. She braced herself for the inevitable question, the demand. But it did not come. He simply waited. The door of the post office creaked open, and an older woman, Martha, the station keeper, stepped out. She nodded to Abel, a gesture of familiar respect. Then her gaze fell on Ilara, and her stern face softened with a flicker of womanly sympathy. "You can have the storeroom in the back, child," Martha offered, her voice raspy. "It is dusty, and there are mice, but it has walls." The choice was laid bare before Ilara, the known misery of a cold, dark room, or the unknown risk of accepting a stranger's help. The wind was picking up now, carrying the bite of the coming storm. Ilara looked from Martha's pitying face to Abel's quiet form. He stood as still as a desert monolith, a man who seemed to ask for nothing. "I have a ranch in the canyon," he said again, his voice carrying over the rising wind. There is a fire and a spare room. She took a slow breath, the dust sharp in her throat. It was a choice between two kinds of desolation. She rose slowly, her body stiff and sore. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She would take the chance. A night of warmth was worth the risk. She had nothing left to lose anyway. The journey in his buckboard wagon was a passage through a world of deepening shadows and stark beauty. The moon rose, huge and silver, casting an ethereal glow on the rust-colored rocks that jutted from the desert floor. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft clopping of the mule's hooves. The silence between them was not awkward or strained. It was a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual solitude under the vast star-dusted sky. Ilara found herself breathing easier, the tight knot of fear in her chest slowly beginning to loosen. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He handled the reins with an easy, practiced skill, his profile a rugged silhouette against the moonlit landscape. He did not speak, and she was grateful for it. Words had become a source of pain for her, weapons used to wound and discard. This man's silence felt like a balm, a shield. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a definite absence of fear. She was simply moving forward, into a night that held no promises, but also no immediate threats. His ranch, which he called Canyon's End, was nestled in a protective crook of the canyon walls. It was a small adobe house, but it was solid and whole, surrounded by a sturdy fence. A light glowed warmly in one window, a beacon in the immense darkness. A well-tended patch of earth showed signs of a stubborn garden. This was a place of order and care, an oasis carved out of the wild. Abel reined in the mules and jumped down. He came around and offered her his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. His grip was firm and steady, helping her down with a respectful strength. Inside, the house smelled of sage and juniper smoke. It was a single room, neat and spare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rifle resting on pegs above it. And on a shelf catching the firelight stood a small wooden cradle, smooth with age and covered in a thin layer of dust. Ilara's gaze froze on it. It was a relic of a life that had been lived and lost. Abel saw where she was looking. He did not say a word, his face unreadable, but a shadow passed through his eyes. In that shared, unspoken moment, she understood that this quiet man carried his own heavy burdens. "You take the bed," Abel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He gestured to a simple cot with a clean wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. "I am used to the floor." Ilara was too weary to protest. She watched as he moved about the room with a quiet efficiency, adding a log to the fire, ladling stew into 2 tin bowls. His movements were deliberate and calm, the actions of a man long accustomed to his own company. He did not hover or fuss over her. He simply provided, creating a small circle of warmth and order in the vast, uncaring wilderness. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. The stew was simple, made from dried meat and beans, but it was hot and nourishing. It was the first real meal she had eaten in days. When she had finished, Ilara found her voice. "I was a seamstress," she said quietly, looking at her own hands. "I had a small shop. I thought I could build a life with my needle and thread." It was a piece of her old self, a life that now seemed like a distant dream. Abel nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Good hands," he murmured, his eyes flicking for a moment to the cradle on the shelf. "Hands that can mend and create are a rare thing in this land." He did not ask what had happened to her shop or her dream. He accepted her words as they were offered. In his quiet acknowledgement, Ilara felt a strange sense of validation. He saw her not as a fallen woman or a burden, but as someone with a skill, a purpose. The weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. Later, as she lay on the cot, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket, she listened to the sounds of the house. The fire settling into glowing embers, the wind howling softly around the adobe walls, and the steady, quiet breathing of the man asleep on the floor near the hearth. For the first time since Dexter had left her, she did not feel hunted. The ever-present fear had receded, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a fragile, tentative sense of safety. A seed of trust, small and delicate, had been planted in the barren soil of her heart. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. A quiet rhythm established itself at Canyon's end. Ilara found purpose in the small routines of the day. She mended Abel's worn clothing with neat, careful stitches, her fingers rediscovering their old skill. She helped tend the small garden, her hands in the cool earth a welcome distraction. She was not a guest, nor was she a servant. She was simply there, a part of the quiet life of the ranch, her presence accepted without question or expectation. The local sheriff, an older man named Brody, would sometimes ride out to the ranch. He was a man who looked weary of the violence and hardship of his job. He treated Abel with a deep, unspoken respect, and his eyes on Ilara were curious but kind. He never asked about her circumstances, a courtesy for which she was grateful. His visits were a reminder that they were not entirely cut off from the world, that a fragile thread of law and order still reached into this remote canyon. One afternoon, an Apache trader named Chayton arrived, his pony laden with blankets and pottery. Abel greeted him not as an intruder but as a neighbor, trading cornmeal for 2 thick wool blankets. Ilara noticed that Chayton's young daughter, who stood shyly behind him, had a tear in her simple dress. On an impulse, Ilara gestured to it. "I can fix that," she offered softly. Chayton looked surprised, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. She took the dress and, with her own needle and thread, repaired it, adding a small, simple flower embroidered near the hem. When Chayton returned a few days later, Ilara gave him the mended dress. He examined her work, his dark eyes taking in the neat stitches and the unexpected embroidery. He said nothing, but he met her gaze and gave a single slow nod of approval. Before he left, he placed a small, beautifully beaded pouch on the table. It was a silent gift, an acknowledgement of her skill and kindness. In that moment, Ilara felt a profound sense of belonging. She was no longer just a woman who had been left behind. She was becoming a part of this harsh, beautiful, and honest world. The peace of Canyon's End was shattered by the return of Dexter Flynn. He rode into Dust Devil's Fork, not as a penitent man, but as a predator who had scented a new opportunity. He had learned that Abel Corbin's ranch possessed the only reliable spring in the entire region. The water was now more valuable to him than any gold claim. His interest in Ilara had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating greed for the land that had given her shelter. He was a man who took what he wanted, and he wanted Abel's water. Flynn immediately set to work poisoning the well of public opinion. He met with Sheriff Brody in the saloon, his voice smooth and reasonable. He spoke of Abel's isolation, his strange quietness, and his dealings with the Apache. "A man who consorts with savages cannot be trusted," Flynn said, loud enough for others to hear. "Who knows what deals he makes with those heathens? He is a danger to us all." He planted seeds of doubt and fear, preying on the settlers' deepest anxieties. When Flynn rode out to the ranch, his charm was a thin veneer over a core of ruthless intent. 2 hard-faced men flanked him. He dismounted, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. He looked at Ilara, who stood on the porch, and his lip curled in a sneer. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "An old maid playing house, thinking she can start over when her time is long past." He then turned his gaze to Abel. "I am here to make you a generous offer for this worthless piece of rock." Ilara felt a cold fury rise within her, chasing away the last vestiges of her fear of him. She stepped forward, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "This land is not for sale," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and neither am I." Dexter's smile vanished. He had expected a broken, weeping woman, not this defiant stranger with fire in her eyes. His gaze hardened. "You will regret this, both of you," he hissed. He mounted his horse and rode away, but the threat lingered in the air, heavy and poisonous. Dexter Flynn was a patient man when it came to cruelty. He did not launch an open attack. Instead, he began a campaign of small torments, designed to wear Abel down. A section of fence would be cut in the night, allowing cattle to wander. A sack of grain would be slashed open, its contents spilled onto the dusty ground. They were petty acts of malice, impossible to prove, but their intent was clear. Abel repaired the damage each time, his face a mask of grim determination, his silence more potent than any angry outburst. Chayton appeared one evening, his face troubled. He had come with a warning. Flynn's men had been seen near the Apache lands, leaving tracks that looked deliberately obvious. "He wants to make it seem like we are raiding," Chayton said, his voice low. "He tries to start a fire between your people and mine." The danger was escalating. Flynn was no longer just a land grabber. He was a man willing to spill blood to get what he wanted, pitting neighbor against neighbor. The tension in the canyon grew thick, like the air before a lightning strike. Sheriff Brody rode out, his face etched with worry. "Folks in town are getting spooked, Abel," he admitted. "Flynn is a smooth talker, and fear makes people stupid." He looked from Abel to Alara, his gaze lingering on her. He was a man caught between his duty and his conscience. He knew Abel was an honest man, but he also knew that a whisper of an Indian raid could ignite the entire territory into a blaze of violence. "Be careful," he warned, his voice heavy. "Fly is the kind of snake that bites when you are not looking." The attack came under the cover of darkness. One of Flynn's men, reeking of cheap whiskey, crept towards the barn with a lit torch. But Abel was waiting. He had been expecting something like this. He moved like a shadow from behind the water trough. There was no gunshot, just the dull thud of a fist meeting a jaw, and the hiss of the torch being extinguished in the dirt. Abel hauled the man to his feet. "Go back to Flynn," he said, his voice a low growl. "You tell him the next time he sends a coward to do his dirty work, I will not be so gentle." That same night, as a sandstorm raged outside, tearing at the small adobe house, Alara's labor began. The pains came hard and fast, wrenching a cry from her lips. The storm had cut them off completely. There would be no help from Martha or anyone else. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Not just for the pain, but for her body. She was not a young woman. She prayed her strength would be enough. Abel was at her side in an instant, his face calm, his hands steady. He had left his rifle by the door and now dedicated himself to this new, more immediate battle. He moved with a quiet competence, boiling water, tearing clean linen. He seemed to know what was needed, his actions guided by a memory she could only guess at. He held her hand through the worst of the pains, his grip a solid anchor in the storm of agony. "Breathe, Alara," he murmured, his voice a steady presence against the howling wind. "You are stronger than you know." He was not a man of many words, but the ones he chose now were the right ones. He was her rock, her fortress against the pain and the fear. Through a haze of exhaustion and effort, she fought. She drew on a reserve of strength she never knew she possessed, a fierce, primal will to bring her child safely into this world. And then, with one final tearing cry that was swallowed by the storm, it was over. A new sound filled the room, small but fierce, the cry of a newborn. Abel caught the baby, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he wrapped the child in a clean cloth. "It is a boy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He placed the tiny, squirming bundle in her arms. Alara looked down at her son, his face pink and perfect, his fists balled up as if ready to take on the world. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of a love so powerful it stole her breath. Outside, the fury of the sandstorm seemed to lessen, its power spent. Inside the small, lamp-lit room, a new world had been born. Abel looked at her, at the child, and a faint, slow smile touched his lips. In that moment, bound by the miracle they had weathered together, they were a family. Dexter Flynn, his rage fueled by whiskey and failure, decided the time for subtlety was over. He gathered his two remaining men. "We are taking that ranch," he slurred, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "The water, the land, all of it, and that woman will learn what it means to defy me." They mounted up and rode out into the pre-dawn stillness that followed the storm, their intentions a dark stain on the clean, washed air. They were riding not just for land, but for a violent reckoning. But they were not unobserved. Chayton, whose camp was nestled high in the canyon rocks, had seen their departure. He knew their destination and their intent. He did not hesitate. He sent his swiftest young rider on a desperate race to Dust Devil's Fork, a message of imminent bloodshed for Sheriff Brody. The boy rode like the wind, his pony's hooves thundering a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. It was a race against time, a race to bring the law before the lawless could act. Flynn and his men arrived at Canyon's End as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. "Corbin!" Flynn bellowed. "Come on out, your time here is done." Abel stepped onto the porch, a rifle held steady in his hands. He did not look angry, only resolved. But just as Flynn's men began to spread out, another sound reached them. The sound of approaching horses, moving fast. From behind a line of boulders, Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies appeared, their own rifles leveled. "It is over, Flynn," Brody's voice boomed. "You are under arrest." For a heart-stopping moment, no one moved. Then Flynn, realizing his trap had closed on him instead, let out a snarl of fury and drew his sidearm. The world erupted in a chaos of smoke and noise. A shot from Brody's rifle sent Flynn spinning, clutching a bloody shoulder. One of his men fell, his face a mask of surprise. The other dropped his weapon and threw his hands high in the air. It was over as quickly as it had begun. The only sounds left were the whimpering of the wounded Flynn and the soft, insistent cry of a newborn baby from inside the adobe house. A month passed. The desert settled back into its quiet rhythms. Dexter Flynn was gone, sent to a federal prison, his name already fading into a cautionary tale told in whispers. Life at Canyon's End found a new, gentler pace. The days were filled with the small, ordinary miracles of a new life. The weight of a sleeping baby, the smell of clean laundry drying in the sun, the shared, easy silence of 2 people who had weathered a storm together and found something precious on the other side. Alara felt the tight, guarded corners of her heart begin to soften and open. One evening, as the setting sun bathed the canyon in hues of gold and rose, Alara sat on the porch, rocking her son, whom she had named Samuel. Abel came and sat beside her, not speaking for a long time, simply sharing the view. The cradle he had once kept on a dusty shelf was now beside her bed, and it was no longer empty. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they had made room for a new future. He had started to smile more, a slow, quiet curving of his lips that transformed his stern face. "I once thought this house would be empty forever," Abel said at last, his voice low and thoughtful. "A place of memory and silence. I was wrong." He turned to look at her, his gaze direct and filled with a deep, unwavering tenderness that made her breath catch. "Alara," he began, his voice suddenly hesitant. "I am not asking if you will stay. I know you have made this your home. I am asking if you will let me build this life with you and Sam, as your husband." Alara looked from Abel's earnest, weathered face to the sleeping child in her arms. She, the woman who had been told her time was past, held a new beginning in her lap. She had arrived here with nothing but a broken promise, and now she was being offered the truest vow of all. She leaned her head against his strong shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. "We are already building it, Abel," she whispered. In his quiet strength, she had not been rescued. She had found the freedom to rescue herself. Here, at Canyon's End, she was finally home.